Hello everyone. Today is lesson 3 of bootcamp and we will start soon in a few moments. Let's wait a few more minutes for people to gather. Yes. Right. A little bit of overview. Those who didn't do homework, please do, because there are only 28 forks and 70 people who are supposed to do it. So it would be nice if others would do it as well, because all other homeworks will be based on forking the branch and making pull requests to request code reviews. Also, if you did the homework and it was wrong, no matter, it will be fixed eventually. You'll manage, so it's okay. All right, I think we can start then. So the topic of this lesson is functions. I made a mistake. So lesson 3 agenda is the following things. Yes. YouTube will be uploaded, don't worry. Anyways, lesson 3 agenda is the following. We'll talk about how a function looks like, what void is for a function. We'll talk about return statement, about scope, what is it, about public and private access modifiers, about big functions, about dry, kiss, and single responsibility principles for a function. So let's start with the beginning. How does a function look like? So a function is an action that basically does something. You call a function and you can either give it input or just ask it to do something. So a function which takes some input, an example of such function could be a boss, which takes employee as an input and gives him something to do. So that's a function with an input. A function without input is, an example could be a person who roams, because they don't know where they go and they can completely manage their own direction. So they don't need input. They just randomly walk in different directions. And how does a function actually look like? Oh, toolbar, sorry. Give me a moment. I think I pressed something. How do I hide this, I wonder? How do I hide it? I think I moved my mouse, it should disappear, probably. Give it some time. Nothing happens. Nope. Yes, I'm using arrow keys, nothing happens. Well, You'll have to live with it, doesn't matter. Anyways, a function has essentially 5 parts. It has an access modifier, return type, name, parameters, and scope. And you can see it in those places. So scope is those brackets right there. That's essentially scope. Don't think much about it. The thing about scope, all that is outside it does not exist. So if I try to call something that's defined within this scope, then I won't be able to, because it will say it's outside the scope. And then other things that the function has, its access modifier, private, public, a return type. In this case, doesn't return anything, so it's void, and name. Lastly, parameters. Every function can have 0 parameters, or it can have many parameters. So it's up to what you need to do. This is how you decide how much input it will have. Also, by default, if I deleted private from this function, it would still be private. Every function by default is private. So the function above and the function below, they are identical. Absolutely the same. The thing about private is that with private functions, you won't be able to call them outside the class scope. So in this case, we have a test class and private static int divide. So if I call test.divide, I won't be able to call it because it's private. I will only be able to call sum because it's public. So if I do something like this, you can see that only sum is visible because divide is private. Now, another example. Imagine you have North and South Koreas, and you try to get a population, a demographics report from outside the Koreas. So you will get a report just fine from South Korea, but it won't work from North Korea because North Korea has it private. And why do we need private then if public works everywhere and private does not? And the answer is because we don't want our functions to be large. We want to split them in steps. And when we split them in steps, they don't have to be public. And if they don't have to be public, they can be private. So for private function steps, use private. So for splitting big function into steps, use private access modifier. So again, a function can return no output, and then its return type is void. So here you can see a function, no return type, and that's void because it doesn't return anything. And it's usually used for, well, I think those are all the cases when we interact with outside components, like a file in this case. Some state is outside, or when we are interacting with a parameter state, for example, an array, but about this in the next lesson. Or when we have internal components, like when the class itself manages its own state, does something with it, and doesn't need to take input. But that's in chapter 2, so bear with me, it will be later. Anyways, a more common thing to get something from a class, to have an output. So a function, just like a variable, has all the types. So a function, just like a variable, has all the return types plus void for no return type. And with a function with a value return type with some return type other than void has to do a return at least once. And it's not just at least once, but it has to return a value sometime in its path. And if it doesn't, it won't work. And it will say that value is not returned from a function. And the question, can you have a private function in a public function? Yes, you can. The point of it is a bit silly in my opinion. It's step for that function. So I would just make it private, not within the scope of another function. That's my preference. What does static do? Static is like a keyword which makes a function or a variable to be called from a class directly without creating that class. Because if you refer to this, for example, I didn't create North Korea, I called report demographics directly. And same for South Korea. Report demographics without creating a Korea. It's a static method. There is only one North Korea and one South Korea. So it kind of makes sense to have it as a static method. But about it later, don't pay too much attention. When we talk about object-oriented programming, we'll delve deeper into it. Now, next. We have a return statement, and return statement terminates a function. If it returns a value, it will terminate the function and return a value. And if it's void, it will just stop. So in the example below, you see that if I say fly and then return immediately, then it means nothing will be changed. It won't print this line because I return immediately. And with this, there are many refactoring things that you can do to reduce scopes of a program, to make it more readable, to play nicely, and so on. Again, it's hard to explain full use of it before we can, in terms of refactoring, before we delve into if statements and loops. So this will not execute and it will say why. Anyways, it might sound weird. A function has no return type, it is void, but it returns. What does a return mean then? And this is what it means. Here is the path that the function travels. When you call main, it will first call test fly, and then it will go to this function, to the fly function test class. And then it will try to execute the writeLine method for report succeeded. And then it will return. This can be amended, it's redundant. If I don't have this, it's identical. Anyways, this is the flow. And return means that I return to the context I was called from. So think that every function has a return because it needs to return to where it was called from. You missed 2 slides, I think. Yes. So we return to the scope we were called from. And what is the scope itself? So in C# you can create scope superficially and probably in other languages as well. So scope is just those brackets, and you will have a scope defined by the dashed line. And you can see here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 scopes in total. And if I define a variable in this scope, it won't be accessible in this scope. However, if I define a variable in this scope, it will be accessible in this one, because the deeper the scope, the smaller the visibility. As you can see, this one basically eats those two. All right. And so every class, every function should have at least 3 scopes, which is namespace, a class, and a function itself. No need to talk about namespace definition yet, nor of a class. We'll talk about it later. Okay, great. Weird stuff happening today, but it doesn't matter. Did I miss a slide? It seems that this is a slide itself, loading slide. Okay, great. Anyways, don't try to code like this. This is PHP code. It looks like this not because it was written in PHP, but it was written by someone who didn't care about reducing scope. But stuff like this exists. I bet that in some old legacy project, stuff like this exists. So there is technique how this scope could be reduced into just one single scope without nesting. But about this, since we cannot talk about if statements yet, that will be... It's not else if as well. It's more smarter than that. It involves the return statement. No, not switch statements. Return. Return, guys. Because if this is false, I can return and ignore the rest. Return the register form. Yes, it's source code from Fallout 76. Well done, who said that. Next. So about static, you asked, I explained, it's basically global. Whatever is public static, it can be called from anywhere you want. So for that reason, it's not the greatest thing as well, because static variable would mean it's in memory for the rest of application. So you don't want that. Again, about this in more detail later. Functions are quite trivial, but to write cleaning functions is not that easy, to be honest. And this is not really taught in universities, and this is sometimes forgotten by even senior developers. So what you're about to see is quite important, as it will make your code actually readable and maintainable. So keep it simple, stupid is the principle, probably the most important principle in programming. And there are 2 quotes that explains it quite well. So make everything as simple as possible, but not simpler, said Albert Einstein. Meaning which, try to make things easy to use, but not mind-numbingly stupid. Keep it simple, and this will create flexibility for your code. And another quote sounds like, it seems that perfection is reached not when there is nothing left to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. And this means that ideal code is code that does exactly what you want and nothing else. And if you removed something from it, or if you added something to it, it will do more or less than you wanted. So we do exactly what we have to do and nothing more. That's a good function. And when you write a function, you should think not only what you have to do, but who will be reading that function. Be empathetic and think about another person. Think if they could understand what you wrote, and if they wouldn't understand what you wrote some time ago, or if you wouldn't be able to understand what you yourself wrote, stop writing such code and refactor it. Don't try to be perfect immediately. Just try to have end result presentable, readable, maintainable. It's a skill that is great to practice as soon as you can, as early on as possible. And this skill is a skill that is not for even some senior developers. So do it early and you'll be great. So, okay, I talk nice, like clean code and stuff, but how do we actually achieve it? We have this big function. How do we clean it up? How do we clean it up? So a function like this, first, is it even a good function? Like, what do we need to do to understand what it does? Personally, I would go like, okay, so I need to read this line, then read this line, and then read this line, and okay, so there's a bunch of text, right? And then it suddenly talks about names. So a white space says Chabmusman. So I would separate this with a white space. Okay, it would be more clear. So it's a name. We read some name from console, and we greet someone with that name. So this part is a greeting. This part is just some intro. And then we say goodbye, and then we read line, and then we say farewell. So we basically say farewell in this part, right? So this function does 3 things, and actually more than 3 things. And we could separate it with 2 white spaces. First white space after these 3 lines, then second white space after these 3 lines. So it's quite dirty. So a better solution would be, split it into white spaces, maybe write a comment. Then we kind of look into it and know what it does, but still, the details are in the way, right? And here's the thing. Code should speak for itself. And this comment basically says that we can split it into a function perfectly. So this function does 3 things. A function which does many things shouldn't implement those things directly. It should just call them. And a function which does many things is a function which mixes levels of abstraction. So a refactored version of this function would look like this. What does main do? Now we can read and immediately tell what it does. We say hello, we greet user, and we say farewell. That's what the function does. And even though this might look like slightly more code, this is much more maintainable solution than the previous one. And the benefit of this is that I look at the function and I immediately know what it does based on the steps, which are functions. And another thing is that if I want to just greet user, change how I greet the user, I won't care about the other 2 functions. I'll just look at this scope. All I care is about this one, not the other 2. And that's the benefit. Right. So divide and conquer, that's what you'll do most of the time. And ideally, where do you place your functions if there's steps? Well, it should read like a chapter of a book. So at the top, you have the highest level functions. So write intro, write chapters, and ending are the highest level functions. They're the first 5 functions that I have at the top. And then details like writing paragraph, sentence, letter follow below in descending level of abstraction. So the more down we go, the lower the level function, and all those step functions are private, because what's the point of writing intro separately, writing chapter 1 separately, if it makes sense only if we write the whole coding story. Next principle is dry. This is called don't repeat yourself, and this problem is especially common for just people who start developing, start coding. Instead of writing separate functions, instead of writing functions for similar code blocks, young developers tend to just copy paste their code. And actually, fun fact, I've even seen developers with 15 years of experience who claim to be a copy-paste developer. And I have zero respect for those kind of people, because that's just not how development should be. Write everything twice is the opposite of dry. It's called wet, and it's annoying. It's annoying, and it's dirty, and it's untestable, unmaintainable, and you will curse the person who does that. Don't repeat yourself, do it, but please keep it simple on top of that. Sometimes it's unavoidable, and you shouldn't always seek for perfection in code. In fact, you should be pragmatic. You should seek for a good enough solution, but it's important to know what you can do. It's important to know what you can do and to use options that are easy to be used instead of just copy pasting, because that's the most simple thing you can do. With a few seconds extra effort, you can make a much better solution rather than just copy pasting. And my rule personally is that if there are 3 or more repetitions, then I will refactor it. If it's 2 repetitions, it can be questionable, and I might take a very pragmatic solution and just ignore it if it's not too big of a deal and if refactoring is hard. But if it's 3 or more, I will try to refactor it. So how do you refactor code? How do you know that you can refactor a function, for example? So when you have a repetition, you have blocks or similar pieces of code that repeat itself. So you split those blocks into their own scope, into their own functions or classes. And then whatever is different comes as input. So here's an example. We have this function. Let's read what it does. We write to the console to type something, and then we read the input. And then we type what we wrote. And then we say we type something more, and then we read it, and then we type what we wrote. But when you do it second time, we add word more. So the similar part is the 2 blocks of code. The difference is word more. So what do? Back, so that you can analyze this and process this. In the meanwhile, I read the questions. Roloff asked, does that also count for if you use 3 times something for input? Yes, it does. It does count for it. So we have similar parts and differences. Like I said, similarities go into functions, or rather one function. So one similarity, one thing that is common between them is that block. And the difference comes as input. So the same code, 0 code duplication. we print input twice, whatever input we wrote to the console. Maybe a better name would be console input because it becomes ambiguous with whatever we pass. But essentially, we took the difference and placed it as a parameter. And the common bits are a function. That's how you refactor code. That's how you make it dry. Now, there are more ways of making it cleaner, but about this in chapter 2, when we talk about object-oriented programmings. So, to be continued about that one. And now let's move on to Visual Studio. So in Visual Studio, I have prepared a little piece of code which does quite a simple thing. So this code sets a letter color, and we start our program in blue. Right, you reminded me. I have prepared to move to the dark side. Boom! I have been converted. Yes, PogChamp. Right. So this basically we start every program by typing in blue. So then we say that we switch color to green and the content goes in green, and then we end our programming story in red and stop. So 3 parts. Basically write intro and reset the color that was before, write content and reset the color that was before, and write outro and reset the content that was before. So if we apply the same solution like before, we could identify the blocks of code that are the same and change them to functions, extract them to functions, and all the blocks that are different, which is color and message, could go as parameter. So let's do that. I have ReSharper, but I'll do it manually. I think it might be too tricky to just click a few mouse clicks and have it done. So private static because we don't need an object created. So private static, and we say print these are all nested within a method. So these are all kind of duplicated blocks. From first sight, they might not look duplicate, like, hey, it's a different color, it's a different message, so it has to be different, right? But no, it's all duplicate, because we do the same thing. We apply a color, print some message, reset the color. Apply the color, print some message, reset the color. Apply the color, print some message, reset the color. If we repeat ourselves, we extract that. So private static void print, and I take this block of code. So we start with this color. That's our initial color for console text. And then we say that we want to, you know, print in another color. And this is the difference. So console color will go as input and message will go as input as well. So right, and then I just say instead of blue, it's input, and instead of this message is this one. And it's duplicate, so new color, I'll call it. And this will be old color. So what did we just do? We said we take message, we give it a new color, and so we say first the old color of the console, then we set it to a new color, so we prepare to write everything afterwards in the new color we set, and then we write the message, some message, and lastly we reset the color. Is it clear for everyone why do I need to save the color and then reset it afterwards? What's the problem if I don't do it? Does anyone have any ideas? Yeah. If I don't reset this, then if I write line without new color, it will write in the last color I wrote with. So I want no side effects in my function. If it did something, it should clean itself so that the global state is not affected. So slightly back so I know what I had to print. So I had to print color blue and I had to print this message. And now I can just do that. String message. And I say print color and message. I messed up the naming. Again, new color, old color. And this is new color, old color. So I print blue and I print this message. That's it. We refactored, so I can do the same for all others. Green. This is the message. And I can do the same for this one. Red. And this is the message. And the other part remains. So now it's absolutely clear what this does. There's no redundant code. So it's quite nice. The question was, can we make a function that we just type blue and it will work? And the answer is not really. We could type it as a string, but if we want to have, you know, some strong types, we need to access it from here. There are workarounds. There are workarounds, but I don't want to show them yet because it's not needed. And the old color is default, and default is white. So console background is black, so the only reasonable default color would be white. So like this, I pass input and get the messages. So if I run this, you can see that it prints the console with the colors I asked it to: blue, green, and red. Now, there is one thing which is interesting. There are subtle details. Which do we care about more? Do we care about the color more or the message that we print? And I think the message matters more. So a more clean solution would be switching those two. Because it makes more sense to have a message first and color only then. So I'll swap the two. Right. So now it makes more sense. Is sorting parameters by importance the general practice? And the answer is yes, of course it is. Because what if you read about color? So you have function print and you want to print text and you don't care about the color, so you might as well just print it in black everywhere. So you read about color first, but you don't care about it. So you might just miss it because you found something you don't care about. But printing will always involve a message and maybe a color. So that's why it's important to have it by the order of importance. And also it sounds more like more readable because we don't say print color message, but we say print message in this color. So it's also a readability factor. Now, what if we go and make another class? So in C# we can make another class. So again, slowly, right click on a project, and the project is bootcamp.chapter. Select add, new item. And from the menu, the first one will be class. So then enter the class name, and I'll name it colorful console. And let's move our method in that class. So what did I do? I just cut it and paste it in the new class that we made. Now, I do want to print something again, and I cannot for some reason. If I hover over print method, it says print does not exist in current context. What do we do to fix this? There is one thing. Somebody said include the class. I can't do that, but it won't work. And this probably comes from a JavaScript background, I presume, because I am still in the same namespace. You know, namespace, you see, system, namespace, interrupt services. I don't know why that one's there, to be honest. And namespace chapter. And the thing is, color for console is in the same namespace. So the using statement is used for things that are in different namespaces. So I don't need to do the using statement. I can just say colorful console print. But wait a minute, I cannot. And compiler is always, IntelliSense is always your friend. It says the errors. So is inaccessible due to its protection level. Yes. So if we go to colorful console, we see that print is private. And in order to call it outside the colorful console scope being these two brackets, denoted by these two brackets, we need to make print public. So let's do that and see what happens. So I made print public instead of private, and voila, no error message. So let's do the same for the two others. And if I hit Ctrl F5, we can see the exactly same result as before. Now, let's make some nonsense stuff like scopes. Scopes that that we superficially created. This, in practical sense, would never make logic, would never make sense. In practice, you will never see anything like this by itself. But for the learning purposes, it's quite useful. So, there was a question, why is it static? Let's remove the static keyword. And let's see what happens now. And it says, an object reference is required for the non-static field, method, or property. An object reference. We need something. And we can only get that something by doing something like, and then we can create it. So with this, we created an object reference, and now we can call the method. But this is object-oriented programming part, and I will not explain much about it, other than the new keyword creates a new reference, and non-static things require a reference. So with a new object, we can create methods from it. But not the scope of this lesson, so don't mind this that much. Just be aware that in order to call stuff from a class directly, it needs to be static. So I'll undo. And here, let's undo. Static. Now, let's play with scopes. Let's say we have a number. Let's call it 10. Well, actually, let's give it a meaningful name. Let's say age is 25. Let's say weight is 70.0. And let's say in here I say float height is 161.9. Now, what if I want to calculate a BMI? I don't need age, so I'll delete it actually. I want to calculate BMI. You're already familiar with the formula. It's weight divided from height in meters. Height in meters, so I'll just immediately turn it into meters. And here's a problem. And again, from height. And here's a problem. If we hover it, it says does not exist in current context. Like I said, stuff from nested context is not accessible to stuff that is outside the context. However, if I did something like this, stuff in higher context is accessible to stuff in lower level context. And this might look like a nonsensical example, superficial and unpractical, but when we start working with if statements, with loops, and more complex situations, this will be important to know why stuff is inaccessible and what do we need to be able to call it. For same reason, if we say static void something, and if we define the same thing here, we won't have errors. But if we define it here, it will say, hey, it already exists in this scope, and this scope is this. So this is the function scope, and whatever is in this function scope, will not exist in this function scope. They are two separate places with two separate scopes, and thus will not share the same context. So anything inside the scope can't be called outside the scope, but anything outside the scope can be called inside the scope. If you declare it like here, outside the scope, you will access it from inside another scope. And vice versa, if you declare it inside this scope, the nested scope, you will not be able to access it outside it. And the answer is to rot car daisy is yes. Basically, whatever is here is not accessible by this one, because you can consider that this right here is its own thing, and this one doesn't know about this one. Well, if I change variables inside the scope, well, first, if I change them, they're gone. I mean, they're not gone, but in this case, they're declared within the scope, within a nested scope. So outside it, they don't exist. When I hit this line of code, those two variables will be gone. Will be as if they didn't exist. So if I do this, this is all the information I can know about the scope. It's unknown to me from this one. Now, let's say we create, like I said, static means global. So public static means global. So if I pass a variable like weight in a different scope, in a static scope, so I delete it here, and I delete it here. And then I say that here weight is, so here I say weight is 75, and here I'll say it's 100. So if I do that and I print the weight before and after, I say wait before. And I'll say here wait after. You will see that it actually changed. So you can see that here is that variable and it changed. It changed because it didn't matter much what scope. Well, it does matter what scope it has. It has a big scope. It's in the scope of a class, and static variables are, like I said, alive during the whole application lifetime. So I'll give some comments now. Public static is like a global variable. It will be alive across the whole application lifetime. So prints 100, prints 75. However, if I did something like this, it will not set it. Let's test it. What happened, guys? Why is it 75 now? Yes, 100 overwrites 75. Do we need to type comments on our code? The answer is, it's up to you and the mentor. If the code is split nicely into functions, the comments are sometimes needed, sometimes not. So the answer is it really depends on how well you wrote your code. Comments are usually a lazy way to escape stuff, but it's very hard for us to express ourselves purely in code. So comments definitely help. And in some cases, they are inevitable and needed. So when we cover all like OP things as well, I can then explain fully when to write comments and when not. Because now it's hard to explain because you still don't have techniques which will make your code speak for yourself. So it's hard to write code without comments completely. Back to the question, what happened? The thing is, it says local variable weight heights field, this one. So be careful not to do something like I just did, because within this scope, I re-declared a variable and gave it the value 100. So me changing the value of that scope had no effect. And this is not a matter of scope, actually. If I did something like this, it would still be the same. I would still oh, okay, I cannot. Okay, so it makes sense. So this one hides the variable, this one. Yes, this is the local scope. This is a method scope. This is a class scope. The inner scope creates its own, yes, okay. Let's see. Can you explain why it states 75? It states 75 because I re-declare the variable. It's already declared and I cannot declare it twice. So if I re-declare it in local scope, it hides the existence of this one because otherwise it would create, ambiguity and I wouldn't be able to call it. So it hides it instead. So this weight is not the same as this weight. This weight is actually a completely different variable, which just happens to have the same name as the other one. So that's the difference. Yeah. No, that's not true. For example, if I had a constructor for program class, I can do this. You see, it doesn't complain at all. So it's valid syntax. So you can do it by mistake. Just be aware that such a mistake can happen. Why the value doesn't, get set. It's because of that. So summarizing, I can use a variable from the outer scope, but not the variable from the inner scope. In this case, 100 is changed inside the inner scope, which is valid and so will persist across. To do what? To change a state of something that is global. Well, it's bad practice to have global state in the first place. That's one. And then immutability, values that are computed and returned and then not touched, is a good thing. Immutability is a good thing in general. So it's a bad practice to have a lot of mutable places, a lot of places that can change. Yes, and it does. You're a correct observation. It does make code more confusing. So it's a good thing that you notice things like that. Right. One more important thing that I was supposed to show. Like we said, return statement just stops the application execution. So if I do something like this and run my application, it terminates immediately. Why does it terminate immediately? Why does it stop? What happened? How did I tell my application to stop? Yes. And there is nothing left to return to, and that's why my whole application terminated. Main is the entry point of application, so if I return immediately in main, that means my application is closed immediately. So sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it does not. For now, it's not much meaning to say when it does and when it doesn't, because we don't have structures which create scope like loops and if statements. But when we do, return will be one of the ways of how we can reduce scopes. Right. So a variable can be accessed directly from a class if I give it a static keyword, static modifier. But if I don't have a static modifier to a variable like this, it will work, but it will only be called from a class. So, I mean, not from a class, but from an object. So if I try to do something like this, it will say an object reference is required for the non-static field, the method. So if you want to have something called from static context, it needs to be static as well, because non-static is inaccessible from static context. It's inaccessible, but because like in the beginning, here we wrote, we had to create a new object of type program in order to call stuff from the program class that is not static. Color for console line. Yes, weight can be called from another class. A can only be called from everywhere actually, but only if we do something like this. New program. And now we can access A. And we can do the same from color for console if needed, and then we could access A as well, but that's outside of the scope. Can you use is also as a paperweight? What? Don't understand the question. Ignore it. It's just for reference. Static, everything for now. You don't need to understand the new keyword. New will come when we learn object-oriented programming. So it's fine. It will be explained in the next month. What are the curly braces after string in main? Curly braces after string in main. Curly braces after string in main. Oh, those. Yes, those are broken brackets, I think, square brackets. Yes, and they are for array. So it means that when I run a console application, just a little background, you don't have to memorize it. It means that when I run my console application, I can run it with some arguments, and those arguments, where do I place them? Here. So I can place here, for example, my name. And if I save this and run program and do something like printing the first argument, again, optional, don't memorize it, just explaining because it was asked. So I can run my application by passing it arguments. By default, no arguments are passed, and I just inputted one argument. I print my own name here. This will be the topic of the next lesson, arrays and how we work with them. Actually, of the 5th lesson. The next lesson will be if statements. Yes, don't ask too many questions about this. Will be explained later. It's very important, but not a scope of this lesson. So, a few more points. I cannot define a variable in a namespace because remember, we can only call it either from a class or in a local scope. So I cannot declare a variable in this place. It's impossible. If I don't say public to a variable, it defaults to private. And what else? So for example, this height is different than this height. And if I try to reach height here, well, no height is there because it's in a nested scope, in a different scope from this one, or in a scope deeper than this one. So it's inaccessible. Don't try to fit everything in a single function. Split it. Also, don't try to put too many parameters in a function. A function with more than 2 parameters is not that great. And the more parameters you have, the worse it gets. Ideally, a function is without any parameters. Don't follow this dogmatically, do whatever makes most sense, develop taste, and you'll be good. Right. Now, do you guys have any questions? If this is still a discussion about arrays, I would appreciate it if we can move on. What is the meaning of life? Well, if you ask that, I'll answer. To me, it's making a meaningful day, not wasting my day, my time, and just helping others, to me, is meaning of my life. I don't see the question. Can you repost the question? Can we, what's the question? Can you repost it, please? And ping me as you do, repost the question. Okay, first, the first question. So swapping the order of message and console color makes no difference. Yes, it makes no difference in terms of functionality, but in terms of readability, it does. Imagine if it was the other way around. If it was like this. How readable is this compared to previous? Look how unfluent this and unnatural this becomes. We say that color for console prints blue and then a message. Or is it better, color for console prints this message in blue, in green, sorry. To me, this is much more readable than the other one. So the order matters. Now, the question about declaring variables. It's a great question, actually, and it's a common one. I'll remove this as it's no longer needed. So what's the difference if we say we have, let's say, a bunch of constants, let's say. constant float, constant float, what's the word for it? VAT in Lithuania, for example, is 21%. Maybe not, I don't remember, but doesn't matter. So what's the difference if I define it here along with other variables, let's say float fridge price, which is, let's say, before taxes. Again, I'll put it as a const. And I say it's, let's say, 1,000 euros. And then suddenly here, I start calculating fridge price. So fridge price after taxes is fridge price before taxes times VAT in Lithuania. Now, here's the thing. Oh, sorry, 1 minus this. Because otherwise we would just get what's the VAT, and we want to get the full price. All right, so what if I wanted to change the type of fridge price before taxes? Or what if I wanted to change the value of VAT in Lithuania? I would do something like this. I would scroll up, change it, scroll all the way down, fix it, and run it again. However, this is not used anywhere in my application except at the bottom. So there's a general rule to place variables, to declare them as close as possible to where they are used. So the closest place would be here. And now if I need to change VATs and other values, I can do so without any effort whatsoever. So don't do a semantic rule. Don't declare variables at the top. Declare them as close to where they're used, because that will make much more sense than the first approach for maintainability and readability reasons. Did this answer your question? I hope it did. All right. Are there any other questions? Did I miss any questions? Can you repost your question? Sorry for asking. Chubsman asked if variables are used throughout the project function. Well, if I use it again, let's say somewhere here to print what it is, and then let's print it there, I guess. If I must print it somewhere here, then I'll keep it at the closest possible place before it was used. So if I have to, if I don't have to, I won't declare them at the top. But you said yourself, it's a necessity. If I have to use it throughout the program, so it will be placed to the closest place where I can still use it, because it needs to be declared before it can be used. If I cannot just do this because it's not declared. It needs to be declared before it's used, so it's not even physically possible to define it there and use it there. Cat Girl Aurora, you wouldn't miss anything important, I think. And even if you did, there is a recording. Okay, then asked the question. Let's say I have letters A, B, C, D, E with values 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, 16. Should I declare them in the same line or use multiple separate lines? And the answer is, it depends on your preference. I personally would not declare them in the same line. I would declare them all in separate lines because it makes it easier to read, understand, maintain. Relem76 asked, not really, because the BA will look at the code with setting up data dictionary tier holes in the for. I don't understand what you mean. What else? Any more questions? Oh, business analyst. Okay. Well, we write code not for business analysts, but for people, for developers. So, developer will understand code easier, and I don't think this will be much more complex for business analyst as well. But this is a valid point. I actually didn't know about this. But again, business analyst will understand code written other way around as well. Since we still have some time before Kahoot, I would like to show... Oh, two more things, right? Two more things. A function can be an input. A function itself can be input as well. If I do something like this, and I think this is the slide that was loading and it didn't load. If I do something like this, what do you think this will print? Yes, it will print whatever I input. So my point here is that I don't have to do this because this will work as well. So if I run this again, oh, I didn't print anything, that's why. So first read line, then second read line prints what I printed, and third read line prints what I printed. So you can see it echoes whatever I printed. I don't... Oh, okay, all good. Can you give us... can you use some example of functions returning something to be used in another part of code? Let's say we created an array, useful phrases in Lithuania. I won't explain this one because this is arrays, and please bear with me. Arrays will be explained in lesson 5. So no questions about arrays yet. Patience. Some I can explain, or for BMI a function, or for some. For BMI a function, or maybe calculate something after taxes. Private float calculate after taxes. So I take in price before taxes, then I take that and I do what I did here. So now instead of having the formula, I can simply call it static. Fridge after tax. Fridge after tax plus equals yeah, you're right. That is correct. Thanks for noting that. Can I do it in a single line? Yes, this will work. Again, this is already not very readable, so I tried to limit return statements into just that. So price before taxes plus price before taxes. Actually, the full solution should have been this and not what I said. I calculated that as if it was a discount, and it's supposed to be something on top of the total price and something not from total price. So calculate after taxes returns fridge price after taxes. Any more questions? Did I miss any questions? If you didn't type return in there, calculate after taxes wouldn't have an updated value. And the answer is, it wouldn't work. You see the error here. It says calculate after taxes, not all paths return a value. Like I said, returning a value from a function with a return type is mandatory. It will only work if I put it void. And if it's float, it won't work. It will require you to return a value. So I have to. Yes. A compiler wouldn't let you because it wouldn't make sense for a compiler to do that. You ask something to be returned, yet you return nothing. So it doesn't work. Any more questions? Silly question, sorry, but why can BMI get calculated in something without a return? Right. Why can BMI be calculated in something without a return? The answer is we don't really return anything from this scope, and everything that is inside the scope just dies, except for this one, because it's from a higher scope. So the BMI that we calculated is not accessible here anymore. You see? It's not there. So, and we could calculate it without a return because it's not a function, it's just an expression, a statement. Yes. Void does not return anything. Right, good question. So if we call if we call a function that is void, so something is void, the result is, and you can see, cannot assign void to an implicitly typed variable. Does it make sense to assign a variable to a void? Like, it doesn't make sense. It would always be nothing. It wouldn't be anything. So what's the point? That's why compiler doesn't even let you do that. It will complain. Any more questions? Yes, Jobsman, what's the question? Yes. Yes, it is. If no more questions. Oh no, Russia is here, guys. Hide. I mean, yes, it returns, but it returns to the calling context, not with a value. And that's why this makes sense, because it returns to this place after the function is done. But the other one doesn't make sense, because it doesn't carry a value with it. So quickly, let me comment. All right, so now let's give me some hype, guys, before we start Kahoot. Hype, hype, hype. No hype, no Kahoot. Click the link below. It's a bit loud for me. Wow, roll off first, so fast. Let's give it a few minutes till we start. Players, 2 more players than the last time. Is Resho actually challenging Roloff to a duel? We'll see, we'll find out. Let's go. So the first question, a function must have a return type, true or false? So 9 people who chose false. A function doesn't have to return, but every function has a return type. It can be anything that a variable is and void. Void is a return type of a function as well. It doesn't return anything, but you have to give it a type. Gotcha! Next. Every function must use a return statement. Is it true or false? I'm not sure what happens if I press skip button, and every function must use a return statement is false because void, you don't have to use a return statement on void. So not every function. Function can have no input. Can a function have no input? Yes, a function can have no input. What is scope? All the parameters coming to the function, everything that gets into curly braces, just beginning and end of function, or all the code within the file. Well done, except one person. A function is still valid if it doesn't have an access modifier, a name, or a return type. Yes, so a function without a name would not be possible, because how do we call a function that doesn't have a name? It's not accurate, but it wasn't in the scope of the lesson. There are anonymous functions, so that's kind of not completely true, but this is obviously true. I mean, if a function doesn't have an access modifier, then I mean, it's valid because it defaults to private. Yes. And return type, well, it has to have one. Next. What will be the output of this function? Sorry for the scrub quality. Oops, this is my bad. This is my bad, sorry. Sorry. I wonder who selected the right one and gets a boost. I'm sorry, evil laughter. This is the correct answer. Okay, next. Don't mind that. This won't work. Why won't it work? Yes, we don't call that one from a class. It is static, so it needs to be called from a class. This won't work. Why? So here's the picture now. So we added the class to the same thing, but it still doesn't work. Why? Seconds and 3 people, 4 people missing, 3 people, 5, 4. All right. Wow, it seems to be more tricky than I expected. As I mentioned, by default, if you don't specify access modifier, it's private. So print is private, and since it's outside the scope of program class, it cannot be called. If it was public, the other part wouldn't matter as well. Next. This function does more than one thing. Why? This is a bit opinionated, but I mentioned what I mean, and this has a lot to do with splitting as much as possible, because now I have to read 4 lines of code. So a function should do one thing and do it well, and that function does more than one thing because it greets the user, which prints something and gets his name, and then the other part that it does, which essentially says farewell to the user, it has its implementation there. Implementation details mixed with high-level calls is what you call a function does more than one thing. So don't mix levels of abstraction, because then your function does more than one thing. So true or false, will this work? Too little time for this. I know I messed up. Hurry up. 5 seconds. 2, 1. It won't work. And it won't work because we write line twice. And we cannot take write line as input because it's void. Void is not a valid return type for a function to be taken as an input. So it won't work. Yes. Yo, 3rd place. Your mom, 2nd place. And number 1. Cannot read Chinese, sorry. Congratulations. Cat Girl. Give some PogChamp to Cat Girl, please. Japanese, okay? Sorry. Sorry for being racist. PogChamp, Cat Girl. Come on. Congratulations. Well done. Thank you for subscription. Now, let's go to one last bit, unrelated to the lesson, just a little about your homework. So I will commit this code now. I'll say lesson 3 done. Save and push. It's so weird in the dark side. Can't recognize anything anymore. Right, and now let's go to the homework branch. So just like the other time, you will have to take the homework branch and fork it. But this time there's one difference, and that difference is unit tests. This is not something that you'll have to look or understand, but this is something that I made to check if you did what was asked. So now, to see if you did what was asked, you will have to run tests. Tests will be run on every pull request. So if your code doesn't do what it should, in pipelines, you will have a build fail message. So let's open the right branch. In this one, it's not even there. But anyways, a build failed, you will see in this message. And you'll also see it in the pull request. So if I open any random pull request, for example, this one, at the bottom, you'll see build failed. So somebody didn't fix errors in their code, and you see build failed, and it's the error for failing to convert from string to bool. Anyways, this thing runs your tests. And if it fails, means your test failed. Now, how do you run tests? If you want to run tests locally, you hit test button and hit run all tests. So if I click it and run our tests, didn't do anything. Okay, it did actually, but it didn't open the test window. So hit tests, test, and then test explorer, and it opens the test window. So I have prepared tests for you, and based on your homework, it will make more sense when I give you the homework. But anyways, your homework will have to pass those 8 tests. So it's BMI calculation and working with console messages, reading and writing, splitting it in a function. Now, how does the homework actually look like? And it is there. This is the homework. So again, you will have to fork a branch, this time chapter 1 homework /3, and you'll have to do what is asked in the homework. Basically remove duplicate code and split that into functions, and also make functions for the things I asked you to. Lastly, one more step that I didn't explain, place the code in this file. So when you're done with, let's say, calculating BMI, you should do something like this. and place it here. This step is needed for tests to pass because tests will check functions, those functions. And if you don't do what is asked in those functions exactly as they're told, it won't work. In the homework, it's explained what I expect you to do. So you just need to place the function calls, not the implementation itself. You call the function. You don't place implementation here. So this is correct. Roloff asked, so clone, fork again, and no way to update the current one. No, because it's a different thing. It's a different homework. In the last homework, you had no tests. In this homework, you now have tests. In the previous homework, there was no tests to be run, and in this one there is. So you cannot use an existing project because you need to do tests. And in order to do tests, you will need to place the code in this class. The calls, not the implementation. The summary tag explains it. Erlington gives a good tip. Yes, you can merge. After you made the fork, you can merge your old branch with the new one. So you won't have to just copy paste code. You will be able to transfer all the code just like that. So that's a good tip. What else? I think that's all. So basically, when you create a PR, you will have your solution built and test ran. So let's say we have a method calculate BMI in main, in program class. This is basically what you did, except all in main. So now we'll have a function for it. And in checks class, I now, instead of returning 0, I'll return this one. So in checks class, instead of returning 0, I return calculate BMI. And this is what I mean by calling implementation. You don't just return the full formula. Float, height. You don't just do this. You return BMI as a formula. Yes. Boot Ninja asks, so clone homework 3 and merge it with 1 and 2 branch? And the answer is yes, that's what you should do. Any more questions about homework? I will link now the slides as well. Actually, I'll link the whole material now in Discord. So I'll link the code, slides, and the Twitch video along with the homework in Discord. And for other things, other things to note, people had troubles. Some people still have troubles forking stuff. So I promised I will make a guide for how to do it step by step in Visual Studio using Git. And I will. I still didn't change that. I just didn't have enough time. So I plan to do that tomorrow. So no worries about that. And tomorrow, hopefully, I'll also write everything in a full article that in a similar manner that I did for lesson 1, the same for lesson 3. Also, lesson material about an article about functions, lesson 3 material essentially. So be patient and it will be there eventually. So I think that answered the question. Yes, those guides will be a wiki page. If people didn't notice yet, there is a wiki already for lesson 1, and now for lesson 2 and 3 will be tomorrow. Patience. About YouTube video of lesson 2, it will be in today. The thing about YouTube videos, I cannot export video immediately because I lose my I mean, that's how Twitch works. You cannot export YouTube videos immediately because if you do, you lose their partnership, your affiliate status. So I cannot. Will there be a way to reset everything in VS concerning Git? And the answer is, I think so. If you hit the home button and go to settings, and you have those two buttons, global and repository settings, and you can hit clear cache, and you can also change all the names here and stuff like that. And if I go here again, settings, repository settings, you can also just, change the settings here. Here are all the possible settings there can be. So just mess with it. Try to make it as default. And if you fail, then I think the best solution would be to just right-click on the project and remove it. So first switch to another one, right-click, remove it, and add it from 0 once again. I hope that answers your question, Relum76. Any more questions? So one more remark. Every 2 weeks, I'll be doing a feedback forum on the last lessons of last 2 weeks. So I would appreciate if you guys sent feedback. You can find it in the announcements. And feedback is important because I strive to improve, to give you better content, to explain better. And I always pay attention to what you think, to what you want, to what you need, to the complaints, to the praises, so that I do the things I did not so good less, and the things that I did good more. So feedback is important. Don't be lazy and give it to me. Thank you. Thank you for a praise. And also about the other 2 lessons, I'm not great at Git and I'm not great at explaining low-level concepts. That's why you saw me being, torn between some questions and not sure what it actually is. But up to lesson 6 or so, I'm pretty confident. And that's my forte. Clean code and object-oriented programming, my forte. So I hope to continue delivering good stuff. Thanks, guys. And it's time to finish the lesson. So thank you all for watching and good night. Take care.